Chapter 1. The Disappearance in the Storage Room. Introduction. Sometimes, the line between the ordinary and the inexplicable is thinner than a whisper. For a little boy, what started as a simple wait for his mother becomes a plunge into the unknown. A disappearance without reason, an absence that tastes like fear, and a question that haunts the empty spaces. What took her? Or worse, where did she go? Danny was 5 years old, a small boy with blonde hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He held tightly to his mother's warm hand as they made their way through the chaotic, bustling train station. The air was thick with the clamor of announcements, the rumble of trains, and the hurried footsteps of people who barely noticed each other. They had just spent the weekend at Grandma Linda's. Danny was tired, his legs sore, but his mother's voice, soft, reassuring, kept the world steady. She stopped near the storage lockers, her red coat a bright splash of color against the dull metal walls. "Sweetheart, wait here for just a minute," she said, kneeling to meet his eyes. Her hands adjusted the straps of his small blue backpack, the one with the smiling dinosaur patch. "I'll grab our bags, and then we'll go see Dad and Emily. I'll be right back." Danny nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. He could be brave. He could wait. His mother smiled, kissed his forehead, and walked away, her heels clicking against the cold, tiled floor. She disappeared into the maze of lockers, her red coat blending briefly with the flow of strangers before vanishing completely. He watched. He waited. The seconds stretched like chewing gum. 1 minute. 2. The hallway felt colder. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker, longer, reaching toward him. The people around him blurred into shapes, faceless, uncaring. The sounds of the station grew distant, muffled, like hearing through a wall. Danny's fingers tightened around the straps of his backpack until his knuckles turned white. "Mom?" he called, his voice barely more than a whisper. No one noticed. A shiver snaked down his spine. His feet felt glued to the floor, even as every instinct screamed for him to move, to run, to find her. But where? The storage lockers stood in neat rows, cold, metallic, and indifferent. Locker number 105 was slightly open, its door ajar like a mouth caught mid-sentence. The bags were there. A large suitcase and 2 striped bags that sagged with the weight of forgotten things. But his mother was gone. "Where's my mom?" he whispered again, his voice trembling. A man's voice answered him, low, gruff, yet strangely kind. "Hey there, kid. Are you okay?" Danny turned to see a police officer kneeling beside him. The man's badge read, Reynolds. His eyes, under the brim of his cap, flickered with uncertainty. "My mom went to get our bags," Danny said. His voice wavered like a thread about to snap. "She said to wait here. She's not back yet." Reynolds' gaze shifted to locker 105. The door swung gently on its hinges, creaking ever so slightly. The bags were real, solid, but the space behind them, empty. Too empty. A cold wind seemed to seep from the locker's darkness, brushing against Reynolds's face. He frowned and stood up, scanning the station with a practiced eye. "Stay with my partner, Officer Mitchell, okay?" Reynolds said, trying to sound confident. "We're going to find your mom. Don't worry." But worry gnawed at the edges of his voice. He stepped away, his boots clacking sharply against the floor. The echoes lingered a little too long, as if the walls themselves were listening. The loudspeaker crackled to life. "Attention, please. If anyone has seen a woman in a red coat, please report to the information desk." The announcement repeated. The words hung in the air like stale smoke, but no one came forward. Reynolds exchanged a glance with Officer Mitchell, who looked back at him, perplexed and uneasy. "Where could she have gone?" Mitchell muttered. "There's only one exit. She didn't come through it. And the kid was standing right there." Maybe she... Reynolds' words trailed off. His eyes fell back to locker 105. The door was wider now, the darkness inside deeper. He swallowed hard. The air around the lockers felt wrong, dense, almost alive, as if the shadows were breathing, waiting. He bent down to look closer. The smell inside the locker made him recoil slightly. Dust mixed with something sour, something chemical? The kind of smell you'd find in forgotten places, places where people shouldn't go. Could someone have locked her inside? He muttered, though the thought seemed absurd. Mitchell shook his head. It's not big enough. And look, the bags are in the way. She couldn't just vanish. Reynolds' fingers brushed against the cold metal door. The chill shot up his arm, colder than it should have been. Behind him, Danny shivered. Somewhere deep in the locker's shadows, there was a sound, so faint it might have been imagined. A whisper, a sigh, or something else, something much worse. Reynolds stood up abruptly. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. "We'll figure it out," he said, but his voice was hollow. Danny didn't answer. He just stared at the open locker, his storm-gray eyes reflecting the empty darkness. And in that moment, Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that the locker wasn't empty at all. It was waiting. Chapter 2. Helpless Theories. Introduction. Disappearing people leave behind more than just empty spaces. They leave questions that gnaw at reality. For officers Reynolds and Mitchell, logic crumbles in the face of a mystery with no easy answers. The lockers hold more than luggage. They hide whispers, shadows, and a growing dread. Where did she go? Or worse, what took her? Officer Reynolds ran a hand over his face, the cold metal of locker 105 still tingling in his fingertips. The boy, Danny, had been taken to the police station. His tear-streaked face was etched in Reynolds' mind. The storage area was eerily quiet now. The distant rumble of trains and the muffled echoes of hurried footsteps felt miles away. The air seemed thicker, the shadows deeper. The locker door still hung open, like a mouth that had forgotten to close. Officer Mitchell stood beside him, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His eyes flicked to the locker, then back to Reynolds. "She didn't just vanish, Reynolds. People don't do that." Reynolds exhaled slowly. "I know." But knowing didn't help. The facts sat like lead weights in his mind. The bags were found in front of locker 105. The boy had been standing in the central hallway. There was only one exit and no one saw her leave. "Maybe she slipped past the kid somehow," Mitchell suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Got lost in the crowd?" Reynolds shook his head. "We've checked the security footage. She went to the locker and then... nothing. She's just gone." The word "gone" hung between them, heavy and absolute. Mitchell glanced around the storage area. Rows of lockers stretched into the distance, their metal doors glinting dully under the flickering lights. The shadows between the rows seemed to shift, almost as if they were watching. "What if she didn't leave?" Mitchell said, his voice barely above a whisper. Reynolds frowned. "What do you mean?" Mitchell gestured to the lockers. "What if she's still here? Somewhere? What if someone, or something, took her and hid her?" Reynolds' gut twisted. The idea was absurd. But then, so was everything else about this case. He stepped closer to locker 105, peering into its dark interior. The air inside felt colder, and that smell, dusty, sour, with a hint of something sharp and chemical, lingered. He reached out, his fingers brushing the inside of the locker. A chill shot up his arm, and for a split second he felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible pulse, like the heartbeat of something very old and very hungry. He jerked his hand back. Mitchell noticed. "What is it?" Reynolds shook his head. "Probably just my imagination." But his hand still tingled, the cold sinking deep into his bones. He looked around the storage area, his eyes narrowing. We need to check everything. Every locker, every corner. If she's here, we'll find her." They split up, each officer moving down a row of lockers. The metal doors clanged and squeaked as they opened and closed them one by one. Each empty locker felt like an accusation, a silent reminder of their failure. Reynolds' thoughts spun wildly. Could she have been kidnapped? If so, how did the kidnapper get past Danny? Why leave the bags behind? Or was there something else, something darker? A cold draft brushed the back of his neck. He turned abruptly, expecting to see someone behind him, but the hallway was empty. "Reynolds!" Mitchell's voice rang out, sharp and urgent. Reynolds rushed over. Mitchell was standing in front of an open locker, his face pale. "Look at this," Mitchell said, pointing inside. Reynolds peered in. At first, it looked empty, just another cold, dark compartment. But then he saw it. Scratch marks on the inside walls. Deep, jagged lines etched into the metal. They looked recent. "Like someone was trying to get out," Mitchell whispered. Reynolds' mouth went dry. He reached out to touch the marks. The metal was ice cold. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "None of this makes sense." Mitchell nodded. "We need to call in backup. Search the entire station. There has to be an explanation." But even as he said it, his eyes betrayed the truth. They were grasping at straws, and in the shadows, something was watching. The lights flickered again, and for a moment, Reynolds thought he heard it. A faint, dragging sound, like something being pulled away, deeper into the darkness. He turned sharply, his heart pounding. The hallway was still empty, but the shadows seemed deeper now, and the cold felt more personal. "What the hell is going on here?" Mitchell whispered. Reynolds didn't have an answer. The silence of the lockers pressed in around them, a cold, metallic promise that whatever had taken Danny's mother was not yet done. And maybe, just maybe, it was still here. Something that didn't want to be found. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Dark. The search for answers pulls officers Reynolds and Mitchell deeper into the shadows of the train station. The logic they rely on begins to fracture as the cold steel lockers seem to whisper secrets no one wants to hear. Something happened here, something far beyond the reach of reason, and the deeper they go, the louder the whispers become. The faint echo of footsteps faded as the last passengers left the storage area. The quiet was heavy now, almost oppressive. The flickering lights hummed with a sickly energy, casting elongated shadows that seemed to breathe. Reynolds wiped the sweat from his brow, though the air was cold enough to bite. He turned to Mitchell, whose face was ghostly pale under the fluorescent glow. "We need to search the entire basement level," Reynolds muttered. "Something's not right here." Mitchell nodded, his jaw clenched. "I don't like this, Reynolds. The kid's mom didn't just vanish. And these scratch marks." He glanced back at the open locker, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Who, or what, could have done that?" Reynolds didn't answer, his gut twisted with a dread he couldn't explain. They moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing too loudly in the stillness. The rows of lockers felt endless, their doors standing like silent sentinels. Each step seemed to pull them further from reality, deeper into some forgotten place where the air was colder, the light dimmer. As they reached the end of the hallway, Reynolds noticed a metal door, half hidden in shadow. It was older than the lockers, its paint chipped and flaking. A small sign hung crookedly above it. "Authorized personnel only." "Have you seen this before?" Reynolds asked, his voice low. Mitchell shook his head. "Number, this place is supposed to be just storage. Why would there be a restricted area?" Reynolds' hand hovered over the handle. It felt cold, unnaturally so. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But something deeper, a need for answers, or maybe just stubbornness, pushed him forward. He turned the handle. The door creaked open. A gust of icy air rushed out, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and rusting metal. The darkness beyond seemed thicker, almost alive. The beam of Reynolds' flashlight cut through it reluctantly, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into the bowels of the station. Mitchell swallowed hard. "You think she could be down there?" Reynolds' jaw tightened. "I don't know, but we need to check." They started down the stairs, the metal steps groaning under their weight. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of rust deepened into something more bitter, something like decay. At the bottom, they found themselves in a long, low-ceilinged corridor lined with more lockers, older and rustier than those above. Pipes snaked along the ceiling, dripping condensation onto the cracked concrete floor. Their flashlights flickered. "Reynolds," Mitchell whispered, his breath visible in the freezing air. "I don't like this. We should call for backup." Reynolds didn't argue. He pulled out his radio, his fingers numb against the plastic. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds. We're in the lower level beneath the storage area, requesting immediate backup. Possible..." The radio crackled, then fell silent. He tried again. Nothing. A low sound echoed down the corridor, a whisper just at the edge of hearing. Reynolds turned sharply, his flashlight beam sweeping over the lockers. They stood silent, their rusted doors closed tight. But the whisper continued, dry and brittle, like leaves scraping over stone. "Help. Me." The words were so faint they might have been a trick of the mind. "Did you hear that?" Mitchell's voice trembled. Reynolds nodded, his throat dry. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steadier than he felt. The whisper stopped. Then, with a slow, grinding screech, one of the locker doors at the far end of the corridor swung open. Reynolds' flashlight flickered. For a moment, he thought he saw something inside the locker, a pale shape, twisted and wrong. But the light blinked out before he could be sure. The door slammed shut. Mitchell took a shaky step back. "Reynolds, we need to get out of here." Reynolds' heart pounded. Every instinct told him to run, to leave this place behind. But his feet stayed rooted to the spot, his mind buzzing with questions. What was down here, and what had they just heard? He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. "We need to find out what's going on. We need to find her." But as they turned back toward the staircase, the door at the top slammed shut with a metallic finality. The whisper returned, louder this time, curling through the darkness like smoke. "You shouldn't be here." Reynolds' flashlight sputtered back to life, casting weak, trembling light on the rusted lockers. They weren't alone. Something was down here with them, something that didn't want to be found. Chapter 4. Deeper into the shadows. Introduction. Some doors shouldn't be opened. Some paths shouldn't be followed. But curiosity and duty propel Officers Reynolds and Mitchell further into the decaying labyrinth beneath the train station. Every step reveals new horrors. The feeling of being hunted, of unseen eyes in the darkness. They've gone too far to turn back, and the whispering shadows are growing bolder. The air was colder now, damp and sour, like a basement that hadn't seen light in decades. The dim beams of their flashlights barely pierced the thick shadows clinging to the cracked walls and rusted lockers. Every drip of water from the overhead pipes echoed like a heartbeat. Reynolds swallowed hard, the lump in his throat refusing to go away. His breath came out in visible puffs, and his hand trembled slightly as he gripped his flashlight. Behind him, Mitchell's footsteps scraped against the concrete floor. "This place feels wrong," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like it's waiting for something." Reynolds nodded, though he wasn't sure if Mitchell could see the gesture. "We need to keep moving. Maybe there's another exit down here." But the words felt hollow. The deeper they went, the more the walls seemed to close in on them, pressing down with a weight that wasn't entirely physical. They passed row after row of rusted lockers, some dented, others covered in streaks of grime. The mist that curled around their feet seemed to grow thicker, colder. Suddenly, a noise shattered the silence, a metallic clang, as if something had fallen or been dropped. Reynolds froze. The sound echoed, bouncing off the walls until it faded into nothing. He swung his flashlight toward the source, but the beam revealed only more lockers and darkness. "Did you see anything?" he asked, his voice strained. Mitchell shook his head, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Number. But something's down here with us." Reynolds' jaw clenched. He could feel it too, the presence, the eyes that seemed to watch from just beyond the edges of the light. He took a step forward, his boots squelching on the damp floor. The whispering returned, faint, like dry leaves brushing against stone. "Leave now." The words scraped at the edges of his mind. He turned to Mitchell, who was pale and breathing heavily. "Did you hear that?" Mitchell nodded slowly, his hand hovering near the holster on his hip. "Yeah, we need to get out of here, Reynolds. Now." But just as they turned to retrace their steps, the lights above them flickered and went out completely. Darkness swallowed them. The cold was immediate and absolute. Reynolds' breath came in shallow gasps as he fought back the rising panic. He clicked his flashlight on, but the beam was weaker now, barely illuminating the few feet ahead. "Mitchell?" he called out. "I'm here," Mitchell's voice answered, though it sounded farther away than it should. Then a slow creak, the sound of metal bending, straining. Reynolds' flashlight wavered as he turned toward the noise. One of the lockers, its door warped and rusted, was opening. The darkness inside it seemed deeper, almost liquid. A cold wind, impossibly cold, drifted out of the locker, carrying a foul stench of rot and decay. Reynolds' knees went weak. He wanted to run, to turn away, but he was rooted to the spot, his heart hammering in his chest. From the depths of the locker came a whisper, clearer this time, and unmistakably human. "Help me!" Reynolds' eyes widened. He stepped closer, his flashlight shaking. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking. "Is someone there?" The darkness inside the locker shifted. For a moment, he thought he saw a face, pale, twisted in fear. Then it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. Mitchell grabbed Reynolds' shoulder, his grip tight and desperate. "We need to go, now!" But as they turned to flee, the sound of metal scraping against metal filled the corridor. Locker doors, one after another, creaked open. The air grew colder with each one, the whispers rising like a chorus of the damned. "Don't stay! Run! It's coming!" The mist thickened, swirling around their legs. Reynolds' flashlight flickered, the beam weakening. Then, from the darkness behind them, came a sound that froze their blood, a low, wet, guttural growl. It was the sound of something ancient, something hungry. Reynolds didn't wait to see what it was. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Mitchell's arm. They sprinted down the corridor, the mist clinging to them like icy fingers. The growl followed, growing louder, closer. The lockers on either side of them seemed to close in, the shadows stretching out like claws. The metal door at the top of the stairs was barely visible in the faint light. They raced toward it, their lungs burning, the growl right on their heels. Reynolds reached the door first. He shoved it open with a grunt, the hinges screaming in protest. Mitchell stumbled through after him, and Reynolds slammed the door shut just as something heavy crashed against it from the other side. They fell to the floor, gasping for breath. The growl faded. The whispers ceased. The door stood silent and cold. Reynolds' hands shook as he reached for his radio. "Dispatch? We need backup. Now!" But even as the words left his mouth, he knew that whatever was down there wasn't finished with them. Not yet. Chapter 5. The Echoes of Fear. Introduction. Reynolds and Mitchell escaped the suffocating darkness of the underground corridor. But safety is an illusion. The station above may be bustling with life, but something from below still lingers in their minds. Every noise is a potential threat. Every shadow hides a whisper of terror. They're no longer sure if they escaped the nightmare or simply brought it back with them. The metal door slammed shut behind them, the echo ringing out like a gunshot. Reynolds leaned against the cold surface, his chest heaving, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his ears. Mitchell slumped beside him, his face ghostly pale. He wiped a hand over his sweat-drenched forehead. What the hell was that? Reynolds shook his head, unable to answer. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The whispers, the shadows, that low, primal growl. It was all still with him, clinging like a cold fog to his thoughts. They were back in the main storage area of the station. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting their sterile glow. The sounds of distant announcements and rushing passengers filled the air, mundane and reassuring. But the normalcy felt wrong, like a mask hiding something rotten underneath. Reynolds forced himself to breathe deeply, to focus. "We need to report this," he said, his voice shaky. "Whatever's down there, it's dangerous." Mitchell nodded, though his eyes flickered with doubt. "You think anyone's going to believe us? We barely believe it ourselves." Reynolds clenched his fists. "It doesn't matter. We can't just let this go." A shrill laugh burst from behind them, and both men jumped. They turned sharply to see a child, no older than 6, skipping past with his mother in tow. The boy glanced back at them, his eyes wide with innocent curiosity. Reynolds' shoulders sagged with relief, but the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. "Let's get out of here," Mitchell muttered, his voice tight. "I need some air." They made their way through the crowd, the noise and bustle of the station wrapping around them like a blanket. But every clatter of luggage, every hiss of the train brakes seemed sharper, more menacing. As they exited the storage area, Reynolds noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Locker 105, the locker where it all started, stood silent, its door slightly ajar again. He swallowed hard. Was it his imagination, or did the shadows inside it seem darker than before? He turned away quickly, his mouth dry. Outside, the chill night air hit them like a wave. The glow of street lamps painted the pavement in pools of yellow light. Mitchell took a deep breath, hands on his knees, trying to steady himself. "I swear," he whispered. "I can still hear it. The whispers." Reynolds nodded. The whispers hadn't left him either. They echoed in his mind, a constant, unsettling murmur just beneath the surface. "Don't stay. It's coming." He rubbed his temples. "We need to get some sleep, Mitchell. Maybe we'll think clearer in the morning." But even as he said it, he knew sleep would be impossible. Not with the memory of that cold, wet growl still vibrating in his bones. They started walking toward the precinct. The street was quiet, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the night. Reynolds glanced at his reflection in a shop window. For a split second, he thought he saw something behind him, a vague, shifting shadow with eyes like coals. He spun around, nothing, just Mitchell, staring at him with the same haunted expression. "You okay?" Mitchell asked softly. Reynolds forced a smile. "Yeah, just jumpy." But as they walked on, Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness hadn't let them go. It had followed them up from the depths, clinging to their heels, waiting for the right moment to whisper again. And he knew, deep down, that this was far from over. Them. Chapter 6. Shadows of the Unknown. Introduction. The horror of what lurked beneath the station refuses to fade. Reynolds and Mitchell's search for answers becomes a journey through fear, doubt, and creeping paranoia. The deeper they dig, the more they realize that the darkness isn't just beneath the station, it's seeping into their reality. Something is stalking them, a shadow with no name, and it won't stop until it has them. The precinct was cold. The flickering lights overhead felt almost too bright, casting harsh reflections on the cracked linoleum floor. Reynolds and Mitchell sat across from each other in the empty break room. The stale aroma of burnt coffee filled the silence between them. Reynolds rubbed his hands together, trying to dispel the cold that had settled into his bones since they left the underground corridor. The whisper of the locker's shadow still echoed in his mind, and no amount of warmth seemed to chase it away. "Reynolds," Mitchell's voice was strained, the exhaustion clear. "We need to talk about what we saw." Reynolds nodded slowly. "Yeah, but what did we see? Because if we try to explain it to anyone, they'll think we've lost it." Mitchell leaned forward, his eyes haunted. "We need to figure it out ourselves, before it's too late." A shiver ran down Reynolds' spine. "Too late for what?" Mitchell's gaze flickered toward the window, where the night outside seemed unnaturally dark. "I don't know, but whatever was down there, it wasn't finished with us. I can feel it." A sharp knock at the door startled them both. Officer Stevens, a young recruit, poked his head inside. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously. Sirs, there's something you should see." They followed Stevens down the hallway, their footsteps echoing off the walls. Reynolds' heart pounded harder with each step. The unease in the air was thick, suffocating. Stevens led them to the evidence room. The door was ajar. "Did someone break in?" Mitchell asked, his hand instinctively going to his holster. Stevens shook his head. "No, but you'll understand when you see it." They stepped inside. The room was cold, colder than it should be. Frost clung to the edges of the metal shelves, and a damp chill hung in the air. In the center of the room, on a metal table, sat a single item, a battered blue backpack, stained, scuffed, and soaked in something dark that had long since dried. Reynolds felt the breath catch in his throat. "That's the kid's backpack," he whispered. "Danny's." Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "How did it get here?" Stevens swallowed hard. "That's the thing. No one logged it in. It just appeared." The silence in the room deepened, pressing in on all sides. Reynolds stepped closer to the backpack. His fingers hovered over the zipper. A cold dread coiled in his gut. "Don't," Mitchell said, his voice tight. "We don't know what's in there." But Reynolds couldn't stop himself. He pulled the zipper open, the sound loud and jagged in the silence. Inside was a scrap of paper, crumpled and torn. He unfolded it with trembling hands. The words were scrawled in shaky handwriting, the ink smudged and faded. "It's in the lockers. Don't let it out." Reynolds' vision blurred. The words seemed to pulse, vibrating with a terrible urgency. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The room darkened for just a moment, long enough for a whisper to slide through the cold air. "You let it out." Reynolds dropped the note. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. He turned to Mitchell, whose face was ashen. "We need to go back," Reynolds said, the words feeling like poison on his tongue. Mitchell's jaw clenched. "Are you insane? After what happened?" "We need to understand what we're dealing with, before it finds us again." A shadow shifted in the corner of the room, just at the edge of vision. They both turned, but the corner was empty. Reynolds' voice was barely audible. "It's already here." The lights flickered once more, and the whisper returned, louder this time. Too late. Chapter 7. Descent into Madness. Introduction. The cold dread in the evidence room is just the beginning. The cryptic message, the whispers, the shadows, everything is pulling Reynolds and Mitchell back beneath the train station. But this time, the fear feels more personal. As they descend once more into the decaying underground corridors, the line between reality and nightmare begins to blur. Something waits for them in the dark, something they may not be ready to face. The hallway leading to the underground entrance seemed longer now, more sinister. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows along the cracked walls. Each step felt like a decision they might regret forever. Reynolds glanced at Mitchell, who was walking beside him. The lines of fear etched into his face made him look older, worn. But there was still determination in his eyes. "Are you sure about this?" Mitchell whispered. His voice seemed to disappear into the cold air. "No," Reynolds replied, gripping his flashlight tighter. "But we have to try. We need answers." They reached the rusted metal door that led to the underground corridor. It loomed before them, a silent guardian to the horrors below. The handle was ice cold under Reynolds's touch. He hesitated, then pushed it open. A wave of damp, stale air rolled over them, carrying the familiar scent of rot and decay. The darkness inside seemed thicker than before, as if it had been waiting for them. Reynolds clicked on his flashlight. The narrow beam sliced through the shadows, revealing the rusted lockers and cracked concrete walls. The mist curled around their feet like icy tendrils. They stepped inside. The door creaked shut behind them, and the sound echoed like a gunshot. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the drip of water from the pipes above, an irregular heartbeat in the silence. Mitchell swallowed hard. "This place feels alive." Reynolds nodded, the knot in his stomach tightening. "It's watching us." They moved forward, the beams of their flashlights darting over the lockers. Some were open, their doors hanging ajar like broken jaws. The mist thickened as they went deeper, muffling their footsteps. Then they heard it, a faint, wet scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. Reynolds stopped, his breath caught in his throat. "Did you hear that?" Mitchell's face was pale. "Yeah." The sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from the far end of the corridor. "Let's go back," Mitchell whispered. "We don't need to see this." But Reynolds shook his head. "We do." They inched forward, the scraping sound becoming clearer. The beam of Reynolds' flashlight wavered as he lifted it toward the end of the corridor. And then they saw it. Locker 216 was open, its door bent and twisted, as if something immense had forced its way out. The floor beneath it was smeared with dark stains, and the air reeked of something foul and ancient. A shadow shifted just beyond the edge of the light, a mass of darkness, formless yet solid. It seemed to breathe, to ripple with a sickening life of its own. 2 pinpricks of light glowed within it, like eyes. The scraping stopped. The darkness watched them. Reynolds's mind screamed at him to run, to get away, but his legs refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadow pulsed, then surged forward. The lockers on either side of the corridor rattled as if struck by a violent wind. "Go!" Reynolds shouted, finally breaking free of his paralysis. They turned and sprinted back toward the entrance. The darkness roared behind them, a guttural sound that rattled their bones. The mist swirled, clinging to their legs, trying to drag them down. Reynolds' heart hammered in his chest. The door was so close, but the shadows were closing in faster. Mitchell reached the door first, slamming into it with his shoulder. It burst open, and they stumbled out into the hallway. Reynolds turned and slammed the door shut, just as the darkness crashed against it with a thunderous boom. The metal groaned under the impact, but it held. Silence. Their gasps for air filled the void. Reynolds's hands trembled as he leaned against the door. He could still feel the cold, oily presence of the darkness behind it. Mitchell sank to the floor, his face buried in his hands. "What the hell was that?" Reynolds didn't answer. There were no words for what they had seen. Only one thought burned in his mind. It got out once. It could get out again. Chapter 8. The thin line between light and shadow. Introduction. Reynolds and Mitchell's world is unraveling. Their sense of reality cracks and paranoia takes hold. The station, once familiar, now feels like a hunting ground. The shadow that once lurked below is now reaching upward, touching everything. Their fear turns to desperation as they realize the darkness isn't just chasing them. It's spreading. The night was cold and unforgiving, the air thick with moisture. Reynolds and Mitchell hurried down the alley beside the station, the narrow path barely lit by the distant glow of streetlights. Their footsteps echoed strangely, as though someone else's feet were keeping pace in the shadows behind them. Mitchell shivered and rubbed his arms. It's colder than it should be. Reynolds didn't respond. His eyes were fixed ahead, scanning every dark corner, every flicker of movement. The adrenaline from their escape was wearing off, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion, but they couldn't stop now. The entrance to the precinct was just around the corner. The thought of safety, of warmth, was almost too much to hope for. They reached the door, and Reynolds fumbled with his keys. The metal was ice-cold against his skin. His hands were trembling, and it took him 3 tries to unlock it. They slipped inside, and the door clicked shut behind them. The warmth of the building wrapped around them, but it did nothing to ease the chill that had settled inside their bones. Mitchell leaned against the wall, his eyes closed. "We need to tell the chief. We need backup." Reynolds shook his head. "Tell him what? That we saw shadows come to life? That there's something living under the station that feeds on people?" Mitchell's eyes snapped open. "We have to try. We can't handle this alone." A sudden noise cut through the air, a metallic scrape, soft but deliberate. They both froze. The sound was coming from the hallway behind them. Reynolds turned slowly, his heart pounding. The corridor was empty, lit only by the dim glow of the overhead lights. The doors to the offices were closed, shadows pooling beneath them. Mitchell's voice was barely a whisper. "Did you hear that?" Reynolds nodded. "Yeah." They stepped into the hallway, the floor creaking beneath their feet. The air here was colder, like a breath of winter trapped inside the walls. The scraping sound came again, longer this time, as if something was dragging itself along the floor. It seemed to be coming from the evidence room. Reynolds felt his stomach twist. "We locked that room." Mitchell swallowed. "I know." They moved toward the door, their hands hovering over their holstered guns. The door to the evidence room was ajar, a thin line of darkness seeping through the gap. Reynolds pushed the door open. The room was a chaos of shadows and cold air. Frost clung to the metal shelves, and the battered blue backpack still sat on the table, its zipper half open like a silent scream. But now there was something else. In the center of the floor was a smear of darkness, a stain that pulsed and twisted as if alive. It stretched out toward them, slow and deliberate, like an ink spill spreading across paper. Mitchell's breath caught in his throat. What is that?" The stain shuddered and grew, tendrils of shadow curling up toward the ceiling. 2 pinpricks of light, eyes cold and malevolent, glowed from within the darkness. A whisper slid through the air, cold and wet. "You! Let me out!" Reynolds's mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his legs felt like lead. The shadow surged forward, the air turning colder, the lights overhead flickering wildly. Mitchell grabbed Reynolds' arm. "We have to get out of here!" They stumbled backward, the door slamming shut behind them. Reynolds turned the lock, his hands shaking. The scraping continued from inside the room, louder now, more urgent. Reynolds pressed his forehead against the cold door. "We can't keep running! We need to end this!" Mitchell's eyes were wild with fear. "How? We don't even know what it is!" Reynolds clenched his fists. "We need to go back to where it started, back to the lockers." Mitchell's face drained of color. "You can't be serious." Reynolds' voice was cold. "It got out because of us. We need to find a way to lock it back in." The hallway around them seemed to darken, the lights flickering weakly. The shadows crept closer, as if listening, waiting. Mitchell took a shaky breath. Then let's finish this. They turned and walked back down the hallway, the weight of the darkness pressing on their shoulders. The station felt like a tomb now, the air filled with a silent, watching dread. And somewhere behind them, the whisper followed. Too late. Chapter 9. Descent into Darkness, Introduction. The line between the known and the unknown has blurred. Every step deeper into this mystery drags officers Reynolds and Mitchell further from the world they understand. The shadows that cling to Locker 105 now feel sentient, as if something waits and watches from the void. But curiosity and duty push them forward, even when survival tells them to turn back. What they are about to face might be beyond comprehension, but the truth demands its price. Reynolds and Mitchell stood in the police precinct parking lot, the cold air biting their faces. The events of the past days weighed heavily on their shoulders, yet the pull of the mystery was relentless. Mitchell glanced at his partner. "We can't leave this alone, can we?" Reynolds shook his head. "Number, we're too deep into this now." The night was still, but an uneasy silence lingered, as if the shadows themselves were listening. The only way forward was to descend once again into the depths of the station, into the place where the darkness seemed to breathe. They returned to the underground corridor. Their footsteps echoed off the cracked concrete walls, the sound swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence. The flickering beams of their flashlights carved thin lines of visibility through the dense shadows. Locker 105 loomed ahead, its door ajar. The air grew colder with each step, a sharp chill that gnawed at their skin. Mitchell whispered, "If there's something waiting for us, something alive, we need to be ready." Reynolds nodded. "Stay close." They reached the locker, and Reynolds extended his hand, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly. He pushed the door open a little wider. The hinges groaned like a distant scream. The darkness inside seemed thicker than before, almost like ink. It swallowed the light of their flashlights, reflecting nothing back. For a moment, the silence was complete, suffocating. And then there was a whisper, a faint, cold voice, so soft it was barely audible. It sounded like a name. Reynolds stepped back, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Did you hear that?" Mitchell's face was pale, his breath misting in the cold air. "Yeah, and I think it knows we're here." The whisper came again, curling out of the locker like a breath of frost, a ghost of a voice. The flashlight beams faltered. The shadows on the walls stretched and shifted, no longer obeying the laws of light. Reynolds clenched his jaw. "We either solve this, or we become part of it." The decision was made. They had to go deeper, even if the shadows never let them return. Chapter 10. Into the Abyss. Introduction. They say that the closer you get to the truth, the more dangerous it becomes. For Reynolds and Mitchell, the darkness behind Locker 105 is no longer just a metaphor. It's real, living, and ready to consume. The line between reality and nightmare blurs as they prepare to confront the thing lurking in the shadows. But some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Reynolds' breath fogged in the cold air as he stared at the open locker. The darkness inside seemed alive, a pulsating void that mocked the beams of their flashlights. The whisper they'd heard moments ago still lingered in the air, like an echo trapped between the walls. Mitchell swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's inside there, Reynolds?" Reynolds shook his head, his eyes fixed on the swirling blackness. "Something that shouldn't exist." A sudden chill passed through the corridor, colder than before. The mist on the floor thickened, curling around their boots like tendrils of ice. Mitchell took a cautious step forward. "We have to know. We have to see." Reynolds hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but they were past the point of retreat. He nodded grimly. Together. They stepped closer, the void in the locker widening like a mouth. The flashlights flickered, their beams struggling to penetrate the swirling darkness. Just as they reached the threshold, the locker door shuddered, and the whisper returned. Louder this time. It was a voice, cold, hollow, calling their names. Reynolds, Mitchell, ... Mitchell's hand trembled as he pointed his flashlight into the locker's depths. For a heartbeat, everything was silent. Then, something moved. A shape began to emerge from the darkness. At first, it was a blur, indistinct. But then it sharpened into something terrifyingly familiar. A human figure, its outline shimmering like a mirage. The figure's face was hidden, but its posture radiated dread. Mitchell's voice cracked. That can't be real. Reynolds tightened his grip on his flashlight. It doesn't matter. It's here. The figure took a step forward, and the air grew colder still. Frost spread along the edges of the locker, spiderwebbing out onto the floor. The lights flickered wildly, casting jagged, distorted shadows that seemed to dance in mockery. The figure raised its head slowly. Two faint, glowing eyes stared back at them. And then it spoke. Leave, while you still can. Reynolds' heart pounded. Who are you? The figure's voice was a sigh, like wind through a graveyard. I was like you. Once. The realization hit Mitchell like a punch. It's a cop? Before they could react, the figure's form wavered, its edges unraveling like smoke. The darkness surged forward, reaching for them with icy fingers. Reynolds shouted, "Get back!" They stumbled away just as the darkness lunged. The locker door slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the corridor was plunged into silence. Their breath came in ragged gasps. The chill remained, but the whisper was gone. For now. Mitchell leaned against the wall, his face pale. What the hell was that? Reynolds stared at the locker, his jaw clenched. A warning! He turned to Mitchell, his eyes grim. We need to find out what happened here, and we need to do it fast. Mitchell nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. Because whatever's in there, it's not going to stay hidden forever. They backed away from locker 105, the shadows watching, waiting. Somewhere in the darkness, a whisper began again. Chapter 11. The Forgotten Ones. Introduction. The line between the living and the lost is razor thin. Reynolds and Mitchell have glimpsed the darkness, but now they must face the truth. A truth that threatens to unravel everything they believe. What if the void behind locker 105 isn't just a doorway, but a prison? And what if those trapped within still remember and want out? The air in the corridor hung heavy with the icy remnants of the encounter. Reynolds and Mitchell stood frozen, the echo of the locker door's slam still ringing in their ears. Mitchell's voice trembled slightly. Did you see those eyes? That thing? It spoke to us? Reynolds nodded, his jaw tight. It wasn't just a thing. It was someone, a cop, or what's left of one. They exchanged a glance, the weight of the realization sinking in. Whoever or whatever was inside that locker wasn't entirely gone. Something remained, something aware, something desperate. We need answers, Mitchell said, his eyes darting to the locker as if expecting it to spring open again. There have to be records, missing persons, unexplained cases. We need to know who's been taken. Reynolds's flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering against the cold air. He shook it, frustration etched into his face. Let's get back to the precinct. We're running blind here. They turned and began the long walk back up the narrow staircase. Each step felt heavier, as though the shadows were trying to pull them back down. The mist thinned as they ascended, but the chill lingered. Back in the precinct, the warm, fluorescent lights felt almost surreal. The hum of office machinery, the low murmur of other officers, the rustle of paperwork, it was all so normal. But for Reynolds and Mitchell, normal was a distant memory. Mitchell booted up an old desktop computer in the records room. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow over his tired face. Reynolds leaned over his shoulder, eyes scanning the menus. "Start with missing persons reports," Reynolds said. "Focus on cases connected to the station or the storage lockers." Mitchell's fingers clacked on the keyboard, the search pulling up dozens of files. Names, dates, faces, each one a story cut short. They scrolled through the records in silence, the sheer number of missing people gnawing at their resolve. Then one file caught Mitchell's eye. "Wait," he murmured, clicking on it. "This one? Officer Samuel Dorsey, disappeared 5 years ago. Last seen at the station, near the lockers." Reynolds exhaled slowly. "That voice. I was like you once. It could be him." Mitchell's hand shook as he clicked through the report. He was investigating a string of thefts. Reported seeing something strange. Said the lockers didn't seem right. Then he just vanished. They sat in silence, the implications sinking in. Reynolds finally spoke. "If this thing has been taking people, cops, civilians, for years, how do we stop it? How do we even fight something we can't understand?" Mitchell clenched his jaw. "We figure out what it wants and why it's been using locker 105. Reynolds' gaze hardened. "And if we can't figure it out?" Mitchell swallowed. "Then we make sure no one else disappears, whatever it takes." The sound of a door creaking open interrupted their thoughts. They turned to see Officer Delgado, one of the night shift clerks, poking his head into the room. "Hey," Delgado said, frowning. "You guys might want to see this." They followed him down the hallway to the evidence room. The door was ajar, just as they had left it. But now, the air was colder. Frost rimed the edges of the shelves, and on the metal table in the center of the room, a single object sat. A badge. It wasn't there before. Mitchell's hand hovered over it, his breath catching. The badge was tarnished, the number almost unreadable. But the name was clear. Samuel Dorsey. A whisper drifted through the room, so faint it could have been a trick of the wind. "Help us." Reynolds took a step back, his pulse hammering. "They're not just gone. They're trapped. And they want out." Mitchell nodded, his face pale but determined. "Then let's get them out." The cold tightened around them, but they didn't move away. They were ready to face the abyss. One last time.